Cherokee. Hello everyone. Hello. My name is Walking Raven Woman. My government name, passport name, is Mariah Gladstone, and I am Blackfeet. I live on the Blackfeet Reservation in northwest Montana, where it is about the same temperature, but a little bit snowier right now. I'm just south of the Medicine Line and just to the east of Glacier National Park. So, kind of gives you an idea of where I'm coming from, but also I'm really excited to share with you guys information about Indigenous food systems and some stories that you can hopefully take away with you as you leave this space and return back to the important work that you do in your home communities. So I want to ground us in a bit of a historical context so we can think about why this work is so important and why restoring Indigenous food systems is so necessary. And it starts because so much of it was very intentionally undone. So I'll bring us back to when the United States was 3 years old, baby government, and the first president, of course, George Washington, wrote orders to Major General Sullivan to march against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Haudenosaunee, sometimes called the Iroquois Confederacy, are in present-day northeast New York and Ontario area, and these orders wrote very clearly to target the food systems, the fields of crops, the storehouses of corn, the seed banks, the gardens, to prevent people from even planting again, in addition to, of course, burning the villages and targeting the people. When the Haudenosaunee people were entering their winter, or the late fall, it actually happened to coincide with the emergence of the cicadas. So it was interesting for people that were facing starvation going into those winter months. They knew that when the cicadas emerged, and they started to gather tons and tons of cicadas, and they survived on this insect protein to help them get them through this very harsh winter. So in Haudenosaunee communities, cicadas are still celebrated as part of their emergence because there's a story of resilience there. There's a story of survival. Even though that wasn't the choice food that people were going after, it did help them survive, and it got them through a period of very hard times. Haudenosaunee languages also translate the word for US president to village burner to this day because of this. So this strategy of targeting Native people through food systems continued to be employed across the continent, and this strategy took shape in different ways depending on the space. In the Great Plains, of course, where my Blackfeet ancestors are from, we were reliant on vast herds of buffalo. Conservative estimates of number of buffalo on the prairies ranged from, on the conservative side, 30 million. On the upper end of estimates were closer to 65 to 70 million buffalo on the prairies prior to colonization. And then food systems and what Native food systems entail. So this graphic is a graphic that I got from Natives, which is a nonprofit based in Minneapolis. It is, I kind of joke around about this graphic because I say Native Graphic Design 101 is put a medicine wheel on it. But it's relevant in this case. This graphic also, if you ever need it, it's available on their website, natives, natifs.org. And it's cool because it breaks food systems down into more than just what are the foods that we're eating, but also all of these other components. So for example, if you've ever gone on a plant walk and someone says, oh yeah, that plant's edible. Okay, that's cool. What part of the plant do you eat? What time of the year do you harvest that plant? How do you cook it? How many can you sustainably take in an area? How do you identify it? Does it look the same right now as it does when you harvest it? Are my kids gonna eat it? Like, there's all these questions around that plant specifically, right? So it's not just that plant's edible, but it's also all of these other knowledge systems around it. Same thing when it comes to cultivated plants. the knowledge of how to plant those, how to take care of them, how do you select for characteristics that you want the future generations of those plants to have, how do you cook and prepare those plants, how do those plants work together with their environment, what seeds do you save, how do you save the seeds, all of these knowledge systems. It's hunting season right now back home, so we're always thinking of sustainability, of course, with our hunting practices, ethics, all of that, and also we want to make sure that if we're taking an animal, we're going to be fully appreciating and utilizing every part of that animal, including, my cousin showed me the tedious process of making bone broth, but he had my mom helping him a lot for things too. So he said, okay, hold these. And he had big, loose leg bones, and he sawed them up with a bone saw while my mom was just holding on to them. I will say it's far easier with a sawzall, if you can find the blades that don't have paint on them. So that's important. Knowledge, indigenous knowledge. And then, of course, you roast them, and then you boil them. And he had a big induction burner and a big steel pot, and then he ditched my mom. He's like, I'll be back in 48 hours, watch that. Okay, cool. And then, of course, all that marrow, the fat comes out of the inside of the bones, and then it sits on the top of this pot. So you skim it out, you strain it, and then you have tallow. Just all you put your beans alongside your corn, and you put your squash seeds down, so that when the beans emerge, they're ready to use corn as a trellis to hang on to. And that way corn is already growing tall and strong, and they use corn as that support system to grow more vertical height, produce more beans. And of course, we know that beans are also a legume, which means that they contain root nodules that have nitrogen-fixing bacteria that help pull the nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil, therefore enriching the soil with the important nutrients that these other plants need. And then of course squash, whether it's pumpkins or butternuts or zucchini or any of these other dozens of varieties of squash that we have, spreads out low on the ground, takes over, and it has these little irritating hairs on its stems and leaves, which prevent certain bugs from crawling on the other plants. They don't like touching these little hairs. But those great big leaves also provide shade to the ground, preventing evaporative loss from the soil, and also preventing sunlight from reaching the ground and allowing competitor weeds to have the sunlight that they would need in order to steal nutrients from the others. So everyone's working together here in this system. And also we use this as a metaphor because of course siblings, maybe coworkers, maybe family members, whoever they are, can be very different and they can have very different strengths and weaknesses, but they can learn to help each other with each other's weaknesses, maybe show support where they have strengths, and then they can form a better system, a better team working together. So it's always fun to have kids act out the three sisters and use that as an example for how they can help support each other in the work that they're doing. But also, I like this because I got peer-reviewed research. As an academic, I like saying I have peer-reviewed research. As a Blackfeet person, I also say, why should I need peer-reviewed research when I have 14,000 years of empirical knowledge? So it's kind of a love-hate relationship here, but I did put some studies in this for you guys, so take it with what you will. So this research is from Cornell University, from a Haudenosaunee researcher actually, Jane Mount Pleasant. She did a crop yield study on Three Sisters planting versus any of those plants as a monoculture. And what she found was that, this graph is showing protein, but she also graphed calories as well. She found that you produce more protein and more calories per hectare when planting traditional Three Sisters mound planting than any of those as a monoculture, which is cool. But you'll also notice that her graph really relies on the consumption of eating those pumpkin seeds in addition to eating the pumpkin flesh. So talking about both of those as part of this partnership and overall nutrition. So kind of cool. I also want to talk a little bit about what's sometimes called the fourth sister, and that's sunflowers. So you guys have probably seen wild sunflowers growing in roadside ditches, just kind of all over the place. And of course our native sunflowers are relatively small and they look like this when they're wild. But native people from the southwest, from here all the way into the northeast, bred sunflowers for different purposes. One of the examples is, of course, this one in the middle. This is a Hopi black dye sunflower. And these sunflowers were bred over generations to have large edible seeds, but also black shells, so that they could be used to make dyes, to of course dye textiles. And then this is a mammoth gray sunflower, bred of course for giant edible seeds, because wild sunflowers, if you've ever had them, you can eat the seeds, but they're tiny, tiny, tiny. So it helps if they get a little bit bigger. It's a really good example of indigenous breeding knowledge of a plant over time. And then, of course, the three sisters, I want to deep dive into corn. And this word, nixtamalization, some people say nixtamalization, but it comes from the Aztec language, so that X is really making a sh sound. Nixtamalization is the process of making corn more digestible by treating the corn with a highly alkaline solution to chemically remove the hull of the corn. Yay, chemistry. Put the engineer on stage. No. So this is basically, you guys recognize that empires that were sustaining themselves off of corn as their predominant grain were not eating it as sweet corn. There were times when people had a green corn ceremony and some sweet corn was eaten, but most of that corn was left on the stalk to mature until those sugars had converted into starches. And then you had dried corn, and you can start to shuck that corn, but instead of shucking it all the way, you start to braid those husks together. You guys have seen braids of garlic? Think braids of corn, so it can completely air dry. Again, this is also dependent on your climate. So sometimes, if your corn doesn't dry all the way and it starts to get moldy, this process also makes it food safe by killing any dangerous pathogens as well. However, if your corn is nice and dry, you guys will also recognize that you can't just bite into dry corn. Your teeth will start to break. So, this process was developed. We're thinking acids and bases, we're going to bases, very high pH, and you can make a very high pH solution by adding wood ashes to water. Now, typically, people will add culinary lime or cal, and that will also raise the pH. You create a lye bath for your corn. And then you cook your corn in this lye bath. If you're cooking with wood ashes, it also adds a lovely smoky flavor. But it chemically removes the hull of the corn, and it turns the bound niacin into free niacin. So it's way more digestible. That cal or wood ashes also adds important calcium that's really absorbable to our bodies. So also another important nutrient that's being incorporated. Okay, lots of fun facts here. Once you do that, then you get hominy. If you grind that up with a coarse grind, then you get grits. And if you grind that up with a fine grind, you have masa. And then you can make tamales or tortillas or all these other delicious foods. In my mom's side, my Cherokee family has Cherokee bean bread, where you put cooked beans in with these balls of masa, basically. And then you boil these dough balls, and then you can slice it open like little hamburger buns, and you can either butter them or you can add meat to the top of them, but they have beans and corn. And that's our traditional bread with these. What's interesting is when corn was brought to Europe, corn was not being treated in this specific way. Instead, because in Europe at the time, this was 1500s, they had big mechanical mills, whether water mills or wind mills, that could just grind dry corn, and then you could turn it into cornmeal. You could cook that into polenta, or you could bake with it. So they didn't want to use this whole process. That was too weird for them. And so instead they were using it as cornmeal and polenta, and they weren't getting the nutrients out of the corn. But a lot of people in peasant communities, especially in Spain and Italy, started eating a lot of corn. They were eating food, but they didn't realize they weren't getting the nutrients out of the food. And so you start to see in these particular regions where peasant communities that are primarily eating these grains are not getting the nutrients, you start seeing epidemics of pellagra, which is a niacin deficiency. And when you have pellagra, your skin develops a severe sensitivity to UV rays. You go outside in the sun, it looks like your skin is burning very badly. So you totally cover up your face, you don't really go out during the day, you cover up all parts of your skin. And if you do go outside, it looks like your skin is burning immediately. And I'm not talking sunburn, I'm talking like third-degree burns looking burn. So it's also from this period of time that we get the origin of the vampire mythology. So I know it's not spooky season anymore, but happy spooky season. It's an interesting connection to the food, but without all those knowledge systems that we were talking about. So, all right, another example. This example comes from all over, really, but this picture comes from Charlie Russell, who was a non-native artist. He moved to Montana when he was 16 years old, and he was actually fluent in plain sign language. So he spent a lot of time with tribes in the area. He actually spent a lot of time with Blackfeet specifically, to the point one time he was staying with us and he ripped his pants open on the butt, and he asked our elders for something to patch his pants with. They gave him a piece of white buckskin. So he sewed this white buckskin up to patch his pants, and we ended up later adopting him into our tribe, and we gave him the name Olakas, which means whitetail. So, Charlie Russell, this is an image of him depicting some Blackfeet land management, which is of course this utilization of fire. Now, fire was utilized by tribes from coast to coast for a number of different reasons. We used fire about every 2 to 5 years on the plains to burn off those old dead grasses and the shrubs, because in the absence of regular burns, you start to see these slower growing shrubs like sagebrush, like wild roses, like shrubby cinquefoil start to take over the prairies. All of our grazing animals don't really like those things, they like grass. So we wanted to keep healthy grasslands and burn off these slower growing bushes. And so we burn prairies, and also, you guys have stepped outside on asphalt in the hot sun. When you have a big black patch of prairie, it gets warmer faster than the surrounding kind of brown, gray patches of prairie. So that warmth, by absorbing solar energy, helps trigger the perennials to wake up, it helps trigger the seeds to germinate, and it creates this system where your spring comes earlier for that freshly burnt patch of prairie than for anything in the surrounding area. And now you have something that also attracts all of these grazing animals. So there's separate peer-reviewed studies of bison, antelope, bighorn sheep, deer, elk, and moose all preferring to graze on lands that has been burnt within the past year than any other patch of land around it, which is interesting. So also helps attract other non-grazing animals. I also like this example. I did a lot of research for my master's about this, but we have a food, it's a root vegetable. We call it a prairie turnip, or moss, M-A-S in Blackfeet. And this is kind of like a low glycemic potato, but it has a very hard seed coat, to the point where if you were trying to grow this in a garden, you would have to take sandpaper to the seed and break the seed coat in order for it to germinate. So the prairie turnips rely on these regular prairie fires in order for their seeds to germinate by breaking that seed coat. If you don't have a prairie fire, it has to go through several freeze-thaw cycles in order for that seed to germinate, just because that's what it takes to break the outside. So prairie turnips have co-evolved with people burning on the landscape as well. And of course there's examples from the Southwest as well. This is another example. This comes from Apache territory in Arizona that folks knew that Apache people, of course, set fires, but they wanted to look back at old tree rings because, of course, these were in oak forests where the oaks were strong enough to tolerate the regular fires. They had nice, thick bark, where you can see, if you take a core sample, these little burn marks every time there's a fire through the oaks continue to grow, but you can track the fires through these tree rings. But they wanted to know what fires in these past tree rings are being set by Apache people, and what fires are just being caused by lightning. Fires do sometimes just happen. So they went through and they actually took tree ring samples both outside of the reservation as well as within the reservation, where people were continuing to burn during this time period. And so what they found was actually very similar intervals to when Blackfeet people were burning our prairies. About every 2 to 5 years, Apache people were burning, so they could trace how often fires were regularly caused by lightning, and then they were looking at how much more frequently fires were occurring in areas where Apache people were still allowed to burn. And they did this for a number of different reasons, but this was part of the cultivation of food forests. Those oak trees that they were tending through this process, of course, produce acorns. And acorns are a relatively high protein food that you can turn into flour or that you can toast and eat, depending on the level of tannins and how much work you're putting into eating the acorns. But what was really cool about this is the fires would burn off competitor trees, like the conifers, the pines that were trying to take over, and the oak trees would be able to survive. This is really, really similar to what was happening in Northern California with people regularly burning oak forests there. Now, because people have not been able to burn for a couple hundred years in that region, you're seeing that what used to be oak forests, where people could go and harvest tons of acorns, has now transitioned and is predominantly conifer forests, where you can't just get tons of acorns, nuts, whatever you're calling the foods that are coming from that region. But it's transitioned to a totally different type of forest because there was not this practice that was being permitted. So it's interesting to see some of those things. So even though you can look at tribes that aren't planting and tending and growing and seed saving, they're still doing forms of agriculture, whether that's herding animals by drawing them to freshly green landscape, or whether that's tending the trees that are growing there with fire. There's still agricultural happening. Okay, remember I told you guys about sunchokes and inulin and all of that? Camas is a really cool example of that. So camas is a food, another root vegetable actually, and grows in Rocky Mountain, high elevation, moist meadows, essentially. Really beautiful flower, but underneath it has this edible root. That root is really high in inulin. So if you eat it, it tastes basically like a raw potato, gross, flavorless, not good, and will give you terrible indigestion. If you slow roast it, as people did in a pit with hot coals for about 36 hours, it will caramelize the sugars in it, and it will turn it into a cross between kind of a sweet potato and a chestnut. And then it turns into kind of a sweet treat that's super delicious. And also, they're digestible after the inulin has broken down in that slow cooking process. But it's very tedious, and I really wanted to do a camas bake. But in order to do this, you need a crew that's gonna help you babysit a fire and hot coals for 36 hours. So I found some high school students that were doing a trail crew in the summer, kind of just outside of our res. And I was like, I explained the whole thing. It's a group of high school boys. And I'm like, yes, hopefully they will want to stay up all night and play with fire, and this will be fun. And they were down to help, because they were just good sports about it, my crazy ideas. So we dug a little mini pit roast. I taught them about camas. We went and harvested. We cleaned it all off. We built our pit roast. And of course, they're like, hey, can we try one raw? Yeah, they tried one raw, just one each. And then they sat around to babysit this fire all night. And I went into my tent because they were going to take the first shift, and I zipped up, but I could hear them within earshot of this fire, and talking and laughing, and then just all night they were just farting. These camas balls. So we were able to successfully pull off a camas roast because of the hard work and teamwork. But I also kind of joke around and say that our food sovereignty is gas-powered in this case. But it was really cool just to be able to do that. You can also break down camas at home in a crock pot if you put a little bit of water in there and you put like a colander in your crock pot with all your camas bulbs and you let it steam cook for about 48 hours, which is tedious. It's a really long time. I've heard you can do it in an Instapot at high pressure for 8 hours, but that concept terrifies me, so I haven't tried it that way. So, interesting traditional foods and really talk about slow food. Okay, buffalo. I want to talk to you guys a little bit about buffalo. It's another peer-reviewed study. This one comes out of Kansas. So buffalo, obviously, cool example of traditional foods for a lot of different reasons, but I've always heard that buffalo are good for the land. So there was a study that was done at the Konza Prairie Biological Station in Kansas, and these researchers basically created on old growth prairie 3 test plots where they fenced off an area and they said, we are not allowing any mega grazers on this land. So no large grazing animals permitted on this test plot. On this test plot here, we're going to allow cattle to graze during the growing season. Cows are not particularly great at getting through snow, so they gave them some supplemental feed during the winter. And then on the last test plot, they said buffalo are allowed to graze here year-round and be buffalo. And then they studied this for 30 years, which is a remarkably long study. And in this time, of course, they're taking soil samples, they're doing research on plant biodiversity, really studying the animal interactions with the land, all these different things. And what they found was that having the grazing animals on the landscape more than doubled the biodiversity of the plant, of the native plant species, than the test plot with no mega grazers allowed, which was really cool. So positive effect on biodiversity. The buffalo improved the biodiversity even more than the cattle did. What they also found, or actually other researchers during this time period found, was that bovine saliva, so whether that's cows, whether that's buffalo, probably yaks as well, other bovine species, have an enzyme in their saliva that will speed up the growth of grasses, grass species, after they've been grazed. So as long as they're not being overgrazed, those grasses are now able to grow faster because of being grazed. So really, really cool. Also, buffalo do a cool thing with their hooves. They're naturally aerating the soil. In some places, and I've worked in the Dakotas, they can't wait that long because their freeze comes much later and the choke cherries get riper earlier. So you toss them in the freezer and that helps. But if you look up a USDA NRCS guide or a plant ID foraging notebook, it will tell you, do not eat the pits of the choke cherry, they are poisonous, because they contain hydrocyanic acid, cyanide. So, if you're eating raw choke cherries, you're spitting out the pits, but all these plains tribes that were eating choke cherries would take the choke cherries and just smash them to oblivion into a choke cherry pulp with the pits included. And then we would dehydrate them. And then we would eat them as little choke cherry patties, or we would rehydrate them later into choke cherry pudding or whatever that may be, because that drying process neutralizes basically the enzymes that release that cyanide, and it makes that cyanide no longer able to hurt you. It does, however, leave the lovely almond flavor, so that helps. But I remember going to an event up north of the border on the Blood Reserve, and one of the elders up there had brought in these little choke cherry patties that were all dried out with the pit pieces in them. And these other elders without teeth would just suck on these little choke cherry patties like little lozenges and kind of rehydrate them in their mouths. And they loved them, even though they had these hard pit pieces in them. They'd just swallow those pieces and just eat sweet choke cherries all day. Because also that dehydration makes them a lot sweeter as well. So I think it's another good example of a plant that can be poisonous, can be dangerous, being turned into something delicious and even really healthy once it's gone through this process, this cooking or dehydration process rather. So I think that's another cool example. So I want to thank you guys. I want to open things up for questions, but I'm also going to mention a couple of things. One, I have a kids cookbook. I'll have it for sale up here if you guys are interested. I'm just going to say $20 the cookbook. If you are interested, I can take cards or cash or Venmo or whatever, all the things. And then also a free resource for you guys. If you are interested in that, if you go to my website and scroll down to the bottom, there's a link to a PDF, which is a toolkit for incorporating more native foods into school meal programs. So this was specifically a partnership with Montana, Partnership to End Childhood Hunger. But of course, USDA accredited guidelines are the same across the board, so no matter what state you're in, this will have some application. And it goes to crediting certain traditional foods, but also it has ideas for bringing some of those traditional food lessons into the classroom if you want to partner with science teachers or culinary teachers or the PE room and do traditional games. There's ideas for all those things as well. And there's 2 weeks of cycle menus in the back. So there's really easy kid-friendly recipes. They're scaled to family size, but you can scale them up to serve whole lunchroom. So if you're interested in that, that's a free PDF on the website as well. And then of course, all the random socials if you guys are trying to yell at me on your Instagram stories or whatever people do. No. If you make a recipe, you can always tag me in your Instagram stories, but just wanted to share those things as well and open things up for questions. Thank you guys so much.